This is Unforgettable Learning, where we talk to L&D visionaries, experts, and mavericks about performance, creativity, and tech. Subscribe to stay in touch.
Stella Collins is the founder and chief learning officer at Stella Labs and a highly recognized expert on the practical application of science-based learning. Her best-selling book, Neuroscience for Learning and Development, which I have and love, offers really practical guidance for designing workplace learning rooted in the science. And her understanding of the challenges faced by organizations in upskilling and reskilling at all levels is unparalleled. We're delighted to have Stella with us for a two-part episode exploring the role, to begin with, on neuroscience in L&D. Stella, welcome to the Unforgettable Learning Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And it's really lovely to see you again, Kate.
It's so nice to see you. And we're really grateful that you could make it on. It was definitely a big dream of mine to have you on here. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Josh, how are you doing? Just checking in, my co-pilot here.
I'm doing great, and I'm thrilled to have Stella here. And you mentioned her book, and now I'm remiss for not having brought my book for a virtual e-autograph from Stella, but that probably isn't professional practice. So maybe we can do it afterwards.
I don't even know how to do that, but if you can find out how and tell me, that would be
great. There's a Zoom thing in there, we can figure it out. Well, actually, this leads us quite nicely into neuroscience, doesn't it? Tenuously, slightly perhaps, but I was thinking that neuroscience is really quite a massive topic, and I think it can be quite overwhelming. Where do you start with this? And I guess which parts of neuroscience, let's face it, not all of it, are relevant for L&D? How do you even tackle that topic?
I think for me, it's about understanding, what not all neuroscience is relevant for learning. And also, I describe neuroscience quite broadly. So some people describe it as purely the physiology of the brain, but I actually describe neuroscience as, that wider understanding of how our brains work, how our brains are connected with our bodies, really, really important. And then thinking about that in terms, in terms of learning, what do we know about the learning process? How do we help people go from knowing or being able to do nothing yet to an acquisition of knowledge and skills? I cut out the kind of child development piece because that's entirely a different process. So it's about working with adults to understand how do they go from thinking, I don't know how to, and I really focus on the doing. I don't know how to do this yet. How am I going to get there? And then thinking about, well, what do we know from the science of learning? And that can be from the physiological science, but also the psychology of it, understanding that. And even the AI now, we're beginning to really have sort of a really interesting connection between AI and neuroscience. It's always been there, but it's becoming more apparent. So how do you get started? I think begin to understand the basics, begin to understand that, humans are really, really good at learning.
Yeah.
But on the whole, we are learning machines, but learning is effortful. It takes a huge amount of energy from our brains and bodies. Our brains, when we're doing nothing very much, use 20% of our energy. So if we're going to help people learn, they have to put effort in. But what we don't want to do is have them put too much effort in that's not helpful. So it's about thinking, how can we make this as brain friendly as we can? How can we use the natural processes of learning and work with them? Because traditionally, most schooling and most training has not done that. We tend to sit people down, which is not brilliant. We tend to throw information at them. And despite the fact you're called sponge, humans are not sponges.
Absorb information endlessly. And also, if you push that analogy too far and you squeeze it, it all comes out.
We're going to need a rebrand.
It all comes out again, indeed.
We're going to need a rebrand, yeah, okay.
We're going to need a new company name.
Where is it? Scratch the name out.
So I think it's about thinking about, how can we make learning that is difficult. Learning is a difficult thing to do. It uses energy. It takes time. It takes, people sort of say it takes a village to teach a child. It takes multiple people to learn something, really. Very hard to learn something entirely on your own. You need that social connectivity too. So I think it's about starting with those things and thinking, well, probably the first thing you need is to have somebody who feels motivated. So how do we How do we harness and keep people motivated? How do we share information with them that is easy to absorb, easy to begin that process of, putting it into long-term memory? What do we know about memory that, helps us build good long-term memories? And that's the long-term memory in terms of, content and information, but also it's not muscle memory. Our muscles don't hold the memory, but that memory for how to do things. It's procedural memory. How do you do all that? How do you help people build habits? Because that's what you're trying to do. And, what are the things people need to do to be able to do all that? So I think it's coming from what are the practical things we need to do? And then what's the science behind that backs up what we're doing practically? People have been good at learning. People have been good at training for, forever. Otherwise we'd not be where we are. But we've sometimes got in the way of ourselves in terms of corporate training, educational training. We've got in the way of ourselves by taking a very old-fashioned kind of factory model of, sit people down, throw information at them, hey, presto, they've got new skills.
There's so much richness. Go on, Josh. It's good.
Sorry,
it's great.
Kate, I jumped ahead of you. That means, I'm triply excited.
I know.
I can't help, and I'm not as far along the journey as you are, but in my understanding and learnings about the brain, or even by extension, how the mind works and processes and learns and creates memory and commits things to memory, I can't help but think about how everything we know about the brain almost goes at odds with how we conventionally use learning. And I get frustrated by it. I can only imagine someone who's written the book on it gets frustrated by it. How do you think we got here? How do you think, and what do you recommend for those that are sort of entrenched in this conventional wisdom world, that we need to exist in this rote learning, this model that we all kind of grew up in, where we think that is the way to learn? When you say something along the lines of, humans have actually been really good learners, that almost doubly frustrates me, because it's like, actually, we're doing something that goes against what we're actually really designed well to do. And so how do you reconcile sort of the world we live in versus what we know to be true about what great learning is?
So one thing, I'm going to possibly bust a myth with you. Rote learning is quite good. Rote learning is an efficient way of learning. If you need to know something and you need, that's how I learned the multiplication tables. I'm still pretty good at multiplication because I learned it over and over and over again. A lot of habit building, a lot of the skills we learn is learning to ride a bike. You do it over and over and over again. Learning to code, you do it over again. Okay, you begin to start shifting. Multiplication, you're not going to change 6 times 6 is 36. It's never going to be different. But the other things you do as you master skills, you're beginning to change them. So just want to bust that myth that rote learning isn't a problem. But what you don't want to have is only rote learning. It works for some things, it doesn't work for others. And the question you asked was, how do you overcome the frustration? I think it's helping people to open up their awareness to the fact, well, how do I really learn things? So, there's I go on a training course, or I sit through some e-learning, or, I do a degree. What were the things that happened? Which things took a lot of time, but which things actually had the impact? And it's beginning to so one of the questions I often ask people, and it works really well here in Belgium, is how did you learn to ride a bike? And nobody ever says, I watched a video, I read a book, I did an e-learning course. Of course they didn't. They did it by the doing. And I think once you begin to unpick that with people, they kind of recognize it. The challenge then becomes shifting the organizational context, because organizations have got this structure, this way of doing things. I mean, it has shifted a lot. I'm sure we've all seen it. When I first started working in training, I would have companies book me for a year ahead, because this is our training program for the year ahead. In November, we want you to be doing this, and the following November, please book that date as well, because we'll be doing the same thing again. That has shifted. People are much more aware of, we need to, kind of check, what do people need to learn to be able to do, rather than just thinking, well, we'll just open up these courses and let people kind of randomly come into them, whether they're ready or not. I was talking to a client recently, who I won't name, and they have a leadership program. We were discussing some of the challenges of their leadership program. And they said, well, it's really interesting because we've got a variety of people on the leadership program. We've got some people who've been leading for about a year. we've got some people who are just starting, and we've got some people who won't be leading for another year. And I said, then why are you teaching those people now? Because by the time the next year comes along, okay, there's some really good skills they could practice in the meantime. But in terms of leadership models and things, they're going to have forgotten those, or you'll have changed anyway. So, it's kind of getting people in the right time. So I think in terms of organization, I think we need to really challenge organizational structural thinking of what have L&D been doing? What do organizations expect? And begin to change that. And maybe it's about taking, small steps where you can, and then big, brave steps where you dare to. Just to follow up to this, I used to run with a colleague a train the trainer program. In fact, we ran lots of programs together. And at the end of the program, I would always say to people, go away and do all of this, just really, really go and be really brave and try as much as you can. And she would say, just one step at a time. And I think that advice is probably true depending on where you are and who you are and how brave you are and what your context is. So either way, either take one step at a time or go in and just say, we're going to stop this. We're going to do something different. Does that answer your question, Josh?
I was going to say, just like riding a bike, right? You either put the, it's been so long since I rode a bike. I even forgot what are those little side wheels you'd put on?
The little
wheels?
Trainer wheels.
Yeah, the little trainer wheels, or you just go full blown, see what happens, so just to bring it back.
But again, things change. So when we were kids, we had trainer wheels, but now what they recommend for little children riding bikes is no trainer wheels, and they learn to balance first, and then they learn to pedal.
Yeah.
That seems to be a change. So, as the evidence we have, as the science we have evolves, as the data mounts up to be this way or that way, then we also have to shift. So even with a neuroscience-based approach, there are some really basic fundamentals, but that doesn't mean you don't have to change the way you actually operate.
I wanted to ask a question, Stella, actually, about application quantity and distance from the time of learning. And I'm sure you must have thought about this, but I sometimes think I've got a terrible memory. And I actually don't know if I do have such a terrible memory. It's just that the circumstances under which I need to apply something, transfer it, don't come up either very often, or they just come up like a year later. So I was thinking about your example of the leadership training, and you learn a lot when you do leadership training and management training. You really learn a lot. And I can imagine that the time it takes to assimilate that and put it into practice and apply it can vary. And so what does the neuroscience tell us about that in terms of successful transfer based on the distance from the moment you've learned something and the number of times you get to apply something?
So I would argue that actually, if you go on your typical traditional leadership program that might be 2 weeks, or it might even be spread across time, but you encounter a lot. You meet a lot of new ideas, some of which will begin to really resonate with you, and maybe they will make you, they'll inspire you enough to make you change your behavior. You also meet a lot of stuff that just because the way our memories are designed, if you're not using it, you will forget it. Because why would our brains put energy into remembering something we don't need? Our brains they use a lot of energy, but they're very smart in terms of being energy efficient. So if you're not going to use it, your brain is not going to put the effort into remembering it. So it is really important, if you're learning something, that you quickly apply it and you apply it multiple times. You also have to think about whether you're learning knowledge or whether you're learning skills.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's loads of evidence around the knowledge pieces, about space repetition, repeating information, 24 hours later, 2 days, 4 days. And having the spaces in between is actually helpful. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to just learn it, recall it tomorrow, recall it on day 2 and day 3 and day 4. The spaces are useful. In terms of skills, I think there's less evidence around how many times and what the intervals should be. Yeah. But again, if you think of learning to ride a bike, you could go on the best bike riding course in the world, and it might take a week and you spend every day on a bike. But if you never pick up a bike again for another year, you're going to get back on that bike and you're going to be a bit better than you were before, but you're still going to be pretty wobbly. It's the same with any skills you're learning. You need to practice. You need to do it over and over again.
And so that's important. And I sometimes think that perhaps some of the things that are being trained, they haven't got a direct route to application or, a readiness. And then that makes me think, well, why are we training this at all?
But in which case, don't do it. Don't do it. This is really important. What is it? I think one of the things is because we tend, a lot of learning tends to happen in kind of groups and cohorts, and you've got to organize things. So maybe there's a sort of an unexplored idea, but maybe there's this idea that everybody will learn something and everybody will apply something. Nobody is going to go back and apply everything because there's all sorts of reasons why they won't. But maybe that's a sort of an unspoken assumption that if everybody learns something and applies something, we moved everybody in different ways a little step forward. The idea of personalised learning now, where we can actually kind of measure, what level are people at? What opportunities do they have to apply this in the workplace? And if they don't have the opportunity, don't do it. And if they have got the opportunity, fantastic. Then now is the really good time to do it.
You came onto a point that I was hoping you would go to on the grounds of personalization, and I maybe want to take this in a slightly different direction because in conversations with stakeholders we have, and I'm sure you have as well too, there's almost this bias in a workplace learning context towards, well, training needs to be in concentrated knowledge packets on single events. And we're here talking about, well, actually, we need more of a practice bias, and we need more of freedom to do things. And we don't know, it's impossible to move an entire organization from here to here in terms of advancing the knowledge, but people will move in different ways, and that's okay. How do you sort of balance and I say this very in broad strokes, but how do you balance the needs of the business ask of, we need training in this concentrated big event knowledge format versus what we know to be true about, well, we actually need a sandbox, we need an environment, we need application, we need doing, and we also need the space and the room for people to move at their own pace, and whatever that may be. How do you, and I say this only because I know in speaking to stakeholders, they have to convince their senior stakeholders about this is the right approach. How do you negotiate that conversation? How do you facilitate that sort of mindset shift to this is actually a much more effective way to learn?
I think talk in the language of the business. So start with, what is it you're trying to achieve as a business? What's the goal you're trying to achieve? And if the goal is we want, 10 people to be able to be agile scrum masters, then let's work out the best way to get there. And then you kind of need to sort of cost it. But you've got to cost it with the kind of yes, you could have a lovely 1 week course and everybody could have a lovely time in a hotel and they could move around and they could explore and that would all be very lovely. But if after that week, they don't have the opportunity to be agile scrum masters, or they're just super busy doing their own jobs and, it gets pushed back and back, then you've actually wasted all that time and money. So I think it's about costing up. Well, how much did it take? How much did it cost us to actually put all these people in one room for a week, if that is what you're doing? What's the impact of that? If it has no impact, what's the... And then if you do it this way, which is just probably spread it over time, maybe allow people, do something more blended where people have the opportunity to, well, I'm going to, I don't know, Josh, about, what your are you a morning person? Are you a nighttime person? You might prefer to do your, formal learning, the kind of the theory connecting pieces. You might prefer to do that in the evening. I might prefer to do it in the morning. Give people some flexibility. And then I think you can bring them together to then, with wherever they've got to start sharing ideas and practicing together, because there is something good about practicing together, learning from each other, getting feedback from other people, learning in a safe environment. And then you've still got to have afterwards something where, people are followed up, they're supported. We know that transfer happens when you've got people who want to learn something, so they have to have a reason. that the learning has been designed with transfer in mind, which is, multiple different things, and that the organization supports the application of that learning. So once you start to talk to senior people about, the cost of running an event versus the cost of actually having your 10 people being able to do the job, then they start to think, okay, all right, so it might take a little bit longer, but if it actually has the impact we want, and it probably won't take, yes, it will take longer, but if it has the impact we want, then it's going to have more. We understand why you're doing it this way. We can see there's a benefit of value in doing it. And when I say it'll take longer over, it might take you 6 weeks to become an agile scrum master, as opposed to 1 week of being in an event. Over the 6 weeks, you probably won't spend any more time doing it, but at least you're practicing and doing it for real, putting it in context. Our brains are really designed our memories are designed to find context really important. So there's some really interesting experiments they did with divers. Teach divers a set of words, and they would teach one group above the water, and they would teach one group below the water. And then when they got them to recall later on, those who'd learned above the water could recall better when they were above the water, and those who'd learned below could recall better below. And, there's loads of evidence around all sorts of experiments around that. So the context in which you learn, if you learn in a hotel, fancy training room, but actually your application is in a factory or out on the road, it's not very contextual. It's not actually supporting the memory of what you learned.
I want to take your incredibly sophisticated anecdote about divers and context and meet it with actually an incredibly dumb one, which is dogs on TikTok, because I think it's actually a really good one. I just saw a video from a TikTok, I don't have TikTok, of a dog who learned sign language because his partner was deaf, and ever since she became a part of the family, the dog quickly found out that she was deaf and has learned now the signs for things like ball and dinner and things like that. And it was showing like a hilariously adorable, cute video, but it just reminded me once again of context, of how rapidly how context can inform how you learn, what motivates you to learn, all of those things. So just wanted to meet divers with dogs on TikTok.
No, that was really good. I call that need. That's the need to learn. The context is the environment in which you're learning it.
Right.
So, but the context is also good because the dog is with the person who is deaf. So the context is also relevant, but it's the need for the dog. This person, doesn't know my normal, or the person can't say, well, I don't know which way around it was, but it's the dog's need that's helping it to learn these things. And need is also hugely important. If we don't need to learn it, why put the effort in?
I wonder if that's also where we get tripped up with these models of learning that have come from school pedagogy and not thinking about andragogy. Like adults learn completely differently to children. Children, first of all, haven't got all that much choice anyway about what happens, but adults will bring their knowledge to it. They will bring their prior experience. They will be incredibly discerning about what they do and don't want to take in. We all have different experience. And that just feels to me like we absolutely have to not be tripped up by, frankly, entirely outmoded. You said at the beginning, Stella, where we sit down, like we have to sit down in a space and do our learning like that. Who says learn when you want?
But that doesn't suit children either. That doesn't suit children either. Children learn differently in terms of developmental things. They can learn. They learn faster because they're programmed to do that. But trying to teach children geography or play football or any of those other things, the process is not so different to adults. They're more receptive. Their neuroplasticity is much greater, and they're generally more curious. They're like, "Whoa, well, I don't mind learning about that because it sounds interesting, as long as you make it interesting." But actually, the process in the brain is not so different.
Maybe it's the way that we've been thinking. The models.
It's the way schools. Schools probably were invented in the, I don't know when schools started, 1100s. Say it was the 1100s. That's quite recent in terms of human history. Yeah. Before that, did children not learn anything? Of course they did, but they learned by watching their parents do things. They learned by having a go, That's why I think the apprenticeship model, and not in the formal sense of, formal, but the apprenticeship model of you start to learn a skill by watching somebody else, and then you get a simple part of that thing to do, and then you get a slightly more complex thing to do. And it takes time, but you're kind of constantly being observed, you're observing, you're getting feedback, but you're doing all the time until, you become skilled at doing it yourself. And why don't we do that? Why don't we do that more in schools, and why don't we do it more at work? Because the purpose of training has sort of become something, and learning at school has become something a bit different. Like school has become the place that people send their children to have them looked after.
Yeah. Now, earlier on in our conversation, you also...
Having said that, I think teachers do a brilliant job an awful lot of the time under very, very difficult circumstances.
No, we agree. I want to circle back, though, to something that you said at the beginning, which was around neuroscience and artificial intelligence. What can you tell us about those two things working together? How are you seeing that done? What is the relationship there?
So I first kind of came across the two way back when I was at university, when we were studying. So the psychology degree I did was a science degree, and we were studying the AI of vision. And so they were trying to build an AI that could see things. It was very sophisticated at the time. It could see straight lines. And they were just beginning to get quite excited that these AI mechanisms could begin to see corners.
Wow.
Obviously,
okay.
Vision has gone on a lot since then.
Moved ahead a few leaps and bounds.
But there's been this kind of development between, AI was sort of looking at, first of all, they were very computer based, but then they started looking at, well, how does the brain learn? Neural networks, can we connect things differently to how we were connecting them? Connecting the technology, can we connect that differently and maybe think about how the brain learns? And then there've been some ideas where people in neuroscience have been thinking, well, how does AI learn? Okay, can we recognize anything can we do any research that helps us see that maybe humans have something similar too? So there's these kind of constant conversations between neuroscience and AI. And because I didn't revise this, I read a really interesting article last week about, and I'll have to see if I can look it up, about how there's a new large language model, I think, that they're thinking will work much more like a human brain with kind of the distributed networks of a human brain. And they think this could be, another breakthrough in terms of AI. But they keep learning from each other.
Interesting. Josh, thoughts?
I don't think we have time for existential dread, Kate.
Not again.
Not another episode of existential dread. No.
I'll try and look up that article and I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
But I something that I kind of think about in sort of the prevalence of it. Obviously, and AI has been around for forever, but the prevalence lately in sort of the public sphere about what AI can or can't do. I think about the relationship between the knowledge dominance of L&D and how AI has such a transformative role in there. And, I forget who kind of provoked it, but it's sort of a natural provocation as well. If AI is there to access any knowledge at any given point in time at the snap of a finger, what is the need or value for learning in the knowledge domain? What do I really need to remember anymore if I can just access it? Just would love your thoughts for it.
So I think with any new invention, it's not really an invention, but any new development, it's worth thinking about, kind of what happened before. And for me, it's, yes, AI can, it can tell you all kinds of amazing things. But if you have no knowledge in that domain at all, you've only got the AI to believe. So you will believe what it tells you. It's the same as if you Google things and you don't know anything about the subject. The first thing that comes up, you can think, sounds credible to me. And you can influence what you Google. I once Googled the neuroscience of MBTI. And hey, there are people writing about the neuroscience of MBTI. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. But you can Google it. So for me, I think we do need to still retain some level of domain knowledge, domain experience and expertise so that we can critique what comes up, so we can evaluate it, so we can validate it. Whether that will always happen, I don't know, because if we stop learning things and we just rely on everything in AI, then I don't know. Then AI is going to be, well, AI probably is going to be much. Knowledge domain certainly is going to be cleverer. Everybody says that. In the skills domain, I had this conversation with somebody the other day. At the moment, as far as I know, AI can't replumb your kitchen for you. But, an AI programmed, really smart, flexible robot, maybe it can. So maybe you can do skills too.
It is a skill that I tremendously lack. And of all the different skills, I'm more than happy for it to do some house run out for me. So,
I mean, they're already talking about AI doing, looking after people in care homes and things like that, aren't they? That, it's seen as empathetic. People find it empathetic because it doesn't get cross. It doesn't get bored. Imagine you've got, my parents very delightedly would tell me, the same story over and over again. AI could listen every time and be really pleasant and say, that's such an interesting story. Whereas I'd be like, oh, Dad, you've told me this story before.
Stella, do you want to touch on your gear model? I feel like that's something that's an important point for us to perhaps close out this episode as we move towards the second episode, where we're going to start thinking about sort of diving in on a practical example of where the neuroscience has been applied and what that looks like. Tell us how gear might help us sort of bridge that gap, what it means.
How it fits together. So the kind of the end point, start with the end in mind. The end point of gear is transfer. We're aiming for transfer in the workplace so that people, can perform and can be productive. The gear model has 4 elements that are all connected together. And that connecting piece for me is the motivation to continue to learn and continue to learn. So if you have a need, you will learn. However good or bad the design is, you will learn if you have a need. So that need to keep on going and that motivation to keep going, even when sometimes, practice gets very boring. Practice can be difficult. You can fail. You're going to experience different emotions as you go through a learning journey. So keeping that motivation at kind of where it needs to be. Sometimes you need high energy. Sometimes you need to reflect and you just need to let your brain kind of make the connections without you physically forcing it. So the motivation is really important. And then the gears in the gear model are, first of all, you need guide. So you do need something to start you off, whether that's information or an experience, but you need something to help you get started, a foundation piece. So that's the guiding piece. And that needs to be, not cognitively overloading, not all dumped at once, but drip fed small chunks. The next piece is the experiment piece. I've got this new information or this new thing I need to practice, but I really don't want to do that at work yet because I'm going to look like an idiot. So, I can do that in a safe place. That could be a sandbox environment. It could be e-learning. It could be, in a workshop with colleagues. But at least you're not having that workshop where you all have to sit and listen to the expert for 2 hours. You've done that part. Now you're doing the experiment. So you're practicing, but still in a safe place and getting feedback and beginning to build your confidence. So then you can apply in the workplace, knowing you're still not, you haven't mastered these things yet, but you're beginning to apply. And what really matters there is that you get support from somebody in the workplace, somebody who can, support you, encourage you, give you feedback, really helpful feedback that helps you to continue to develop, because we know that's really important. And then the final piece is the retention piece. So, I've done the guide, I've done the experiment, I've done the apply, and I need to continue doing the apply. Once will never be enough. I need to continue. But also, how am I going to retain both the knowledge and the skills over the long term? And that's for the knowledge, that's where spaced repetition is really, really helpful. And then for the application, it's kind of retaining and building the habits, because what you're trying to do is build habits, because habits are so much less brain hungry, much less energy consuming than cognitive thinking. So it's guide, experiment, apply, and retain.
I love it. Thank you. What a lovely model. And what I'd love to do is understand just I guess that's all aligned to neuroscience. I mean, it sounds like it is. There's lots of sort of practice and support and feedback, which feels really important. And just, you said a word earlier that's really struck me. You said perhaps maybe we'll have encountered information, but maybe we didn't learn anything. And I think there is something important to be noted, that being exposed to information isn't really learning. Maybe it's part of this process. Perhaps it's part of the guide. Maybe you've done some practice activities. They're part of it, but we need to be cognizant of the whole thing and the time it takes to do that.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Well, look, I think we are out of time for this session, and I've really, really enjoyed it. And thank you so much. And we're going to come back and speak soon about neuroscience and how that's been woven into a practical example that you're going to tell us about. So we'll look forward to that. Stella, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to stay up to date with leading lights from L&D and leave us a review to let us know what you think.